Um, oh,
Apologies, I had forgotten to put the record button, to hit the record button. We are recording the event, sorry. This is my error. It's been a big day. Um, we are recording the event. If you this information was disclosed on the sign up documentation, and I hope that will be okay with people. The event will be shared afterwards. I'm very sorry for forgetting to press the record button at the beginning. So it has been a very big day. Sorry, Cody, I interrupted you. We're talking about what we mean by intersex.
so yeah, we've to recap, I guess, for the benefit of anyone watching the recording of this, we've just done a round of introductions. We have Morgan Carpenter and myself here from Intersex Human Rights Australia. We have Simone-Lisa Anderson coming from Working It Out. And we've got Bonnie Hart, who is a freelance wildcard currently working for the Queensland Council, I believe. And we're just about to get into a conversation about inclusive practice, and I've been asked to help define intersex. And I gave a beautiful word-for-word definition of intersex that we use at ERA, but I wanted to talk about a more personal experience of intersex, and that was being born different, living with a lot of shame and stigma, and having to go to a lot of doctor's appointments, having surgical scars that I could never explain, and finally being told that I was born differently from other people when I was 17. And I think that how that shaped my life is that I never wanted to see other people have those experiences of that life in their own lives. And so that's what's driven me to be an advocate, is that I don't want people living in shame and secrecy. I want people to be proud of who they are, and I want people to have much, much better experiences where they can feel safe and happy in their bodies, and make their own choices and be in control of their destiny in a way that was fundamentally denied to me. So to me, that's what that's what being intersex means to me. Um, I guess I can pass it off to anyone who wants to chip in.
Bonnie, do you feel you want to add to that?
How can you follow that up? Thanks, Cody, for intersex in a minute. I think, obviously intersex is known by many different names, and different people with who have innate variations in sex characteristics, be they chromosomes, hormonal makeup, different types of sexual reproductive anatomy. Anyone who has innate atypical sex characteristics could be considered to be intersex, but not everyone uses that term to talk about their body. And people use very different terms in different spaces. Most people come to know that they have an intersex variation by receiving diagnostic information from our clinical space. So not everyone obviously is born with atypical sex characteristics. Some of these characteristics only become apparent later in life, such as like when someone experiences a puberty that they weren't expecting, or doesn't experience a puberty, or later on in life when they're trying to start a family, or just spontaneously through other different types of screening processes. So we're talking about a really large cohort of people. We're talking about infants, young people, adolescents, adults, but we're also talking about parents as well, because many intersex variations obviously can be related to genetics, and so they can be inherited, and they can be people with the same intersex variation, depending on the intersex variation, because there's more than 40 of them that have been described by science. Yeah, there can be multiple people in the same family with the same type of intersex variation. So we're a really diverse group of people. It's really hard to speak about intersex as a population, because we're always trying to speak specifically about issues, but generally about population, because, intersex variations can occur for people with XX chromosomes, XY chromosomes, XX, XO, like mosaic chromosomes, different types of different types of sex characteristics, and those present very differently. So there can be people who have male, female gender identity, people who have non-binary gender identities, and any different range of identity or orientations that go along with being a human. So it's a difficult space to be in, because also we have commonalities around the experiences that we have, and particularly the experiences, we're unified a lot by our experiences of healthcare, and often how negative they can be, how pathologized intersex bodies are in healthcare settings, and the long-term impacts that that has on us as individuals, but also on our families, on the way that we engage with society, on the way that we're seen by others, and the way that we see ourselves. And obviously that has lifelong implications for mental health, but also has social implications in terms of not being able to access services that know anything about us, remaining obscured and hidden and separated from one another. And generally, the same systems that harmed us in the past have continued to do harm because of that general lack of awareness that happens from not talking more about intersex. So thanks everyone for coming today, Intersex Awareness Day. This is what we're doing. We're talking intersex so that we can start to pull on those little threads and close those safety nets for people.
Thanks,
But
Bonnie.
also, so yeah, close that safety net for future people that are born with variations in sex characteristics. But importantly as well, trying to ensure that the services that are available to intersex people now of all ages are affirmative and inclusive and can meet the needs of our community. I think what's really difficult, sorry to snatch the mic, but what's really hard for intersex people is that we spend so much of our life making sense of the things that happen to us behind closed doors that we then have to try and use that knowledge and reckoning to educate every single service provider that we need to access. Time and time again, the amount of doctors I've explained my intersex variation to and have been met with kind of professional indignancy that they should have to listen to their patient explain medicine to them. So that type of dynamic creates a lot of pressure on individuals. So I think the most important thing about inclusive practice is that it does the work to take the pressure off the individual so that the service is more custom fit to that person and they don't have to struggle to be able to access it.
So, Simone-Lisa, how would you define intersex?
Intersex is more about language acquisition. Without the acquisition of language, it's very difficult to understand what a variation is, especially when pathologizing language is mostly used. Not having access to language is very isolating. As a parent, as someone that is a gatekeeper to language for my child, not having enough information causes a very closed reality, and with that reality comes harm. And as an advocate, I'd like to stop that harm. So then language is easily accessible and is known. I realize that's not answering the question.
But it's fair to say that if, as a parent, all you're hearing is words like disorders of sex development being used to describe your child, it's locking you off from a lot of community and a lot of resources that are written for an intersex audience.
Absolutely correct. Without having the knowledge of what intersex is, as has been very well done by both Cody and Bonnie, you are blocked off from that knowledge. You are blocked off from a pathway that could be for you and your child. And not having that, and not having that understanding and that language is very sad. It's very, as I said, isolating. So I'm really happy that I understand what intersex is, and I'm happy that I'm able to provide that to other parents and other members of the community.
So it seems to me then that you know, having a language to talk about your body in an affirmative way. So, for example, using the word intersex can connect you to people and connect you to information sources that can help you to make sense of your body and your experiences. And if you don't have access to that language, then you are not really well able to advocate for yourself in medical settings or advocate for your child in medical settings. That's one of the key issues, I think, that Bonnie and Simone-Lisa that you're describing. So
Absolutely.
I think it's also the case that there are many different ways of understanding what it means to have an intersex variation. So clinically, there is this language of disorders of sex development, which is sometimes ameliorated as differences of sex development, which is another umbrella term to describe a set of physical characteristics or traits. And then there's also specific diagnostic language. So each particular intersex variation has its own terminology that changes over time, and different people of different ages will have heard different language. And it's also the case that people in social and community spaces, or the public and governments and policymakers also have a different understanding of other language. So the word intersex is often added to LGBTI, and there are particular understandings of what it means to be intersex that are quite common in social spaces that maybe don't reflect the reality of lived experience very well. Are there any kind of common misconceptions or misunderstandings that you've heard?
Well, I was just sort of like what you're talking about. I immediately came to mind like how there's also a lot of outdated and harmful ideas because people don't necessarily make the associations with the updated language. I mean, who here has tried to explain intersex to another person and then just had them come back at you with like, "Oh, you mean a hermaphrodite?" Like, which maybe I should have given a little bit of warning before I went and dropped the H-bomb on stream, but like I think there is this sort of idea where we do have a lot of these very disconnected ideas, and it's very, very hard to navigate, connect them all together and navigate people in the same sort of like direction.
Yeah. Are there any other kind of misconceptions that you've heard about what it means to be intersex?
Yes, I'm actually part of the trans community due to another child of mine. I had the whole set. I had a cisgendered, an intersex, and a trans child. Lucky me. And I've heard in trans circles that trans people, once they have their sex changes, that they are now intersex because they have had a change of sex characteristics, which I debunk consistently. And it's very unfortunate that these people take on that, I don't know, that word as their own when it doesn't belong to them, because intersex is about innate variations, not variations that occur at another time of their life, even though intersex variations can be noted at different times of your life.
I mean, wanting to be compassionate about that, I think that often the use of language around intersex by people with a trans experience who don't have an innate variation occurs out of a sense that they might be better respected or treated better by people. And or a sense of just a lack of awareness, because there isn't much awareness about intersex variations in society.
Absolutely none, honestly, Morgan. As someone that has been advocating quite hard and consistently, there is a huge lack of knowledge right through the government, through to the general population. And it's exceedingly difficult to continually pound that message that it's innate features that are an intersex variation or a variation of sex characteristics. It takes so long and so many times to help people understand, but once they understand, their support is instant, and they are appalled at what occurs to intersex bodies without consent.
So I think that's the crux of why it's important to have space to talk about intersex issues specifically, that there are specific needs, concerns, human rights violations that happen to people with intersex traits. So
It was one thing that jumped out at me recently. Sorry, did I just talk over the top of someone?
no, please go ahead.
Was Morgan, you and I were privileged to do an interview with another colleague of ours, Mimi. And what was interesting to me was that the three of us were interviewed separately by the journalist, and we all had different ideas and different thoughts. But one thing that was highlighted in the article is that we all talked about the idea of intersex being used to prop up non-binary identity and prop up trans identity. And I think as someone who is intersex and non-binary, and I guess my expression of non-binary is a rejection of the violence that I grew up with. I sort of exist in a very interesting space where it's difficult to advocate for my needs as a non-binary person and an intersex person, because we have these very mixed up ideas of how, very mixed up ideas of how intersex is presented as a spectrum, as a physical spectrum. Therefore, non-binary exists as a psychological spectrum. These sorts of false equivalencies that are meant to prop up trans and non-binary people, where actually the argument in favor of trans and non-binary people is that they exist on their own terms.
Just quickly, I'd like to do a shout out to Anna Pike. It's good to see you online. She is a fellow Tasmanian. Yay.
Hi.
Sorry.
I think I just spoke at the top of Bonnie, so I'll pass it off to you.
Thanks, Cody. I think obviously misconceptions play into this, play into intersex advocacy in a really obtuse way. I think ideas, misunderstandings about what intersex is and who intersex people are create a lot of distortion for us as a community. As advocates, we spend a lot of time trying to extricate intersex out of this universal belief. So it feels like sometimes that intersex is an analogy for the third sex, and that all people with diverse variations and sex characteristics are part of that third sex, which obviously isn't true. And that in itself actually alienates many people with variations in sex characteristics that are male or female, that are ostensibly, that are cisgendered, were assigned male and female at birth and have lived their life that way. But
I think it's just trying to tease that apart a little bit, just to be clear to people. Because intersex traits are biological, and there are very many of them, like perhaps more than 40 different kinds of intersex trait, even those that are kind of have a particular diagnostic term attached to them, then there are very many different kinds of lived experiences. People with intersex variations are assigned female or male at birth based upon sex characteristics observed at birth. Where there is doubt clinicians take into account a number of factors in sex determination, which include ascertaining the trait so that they can then use empirical data which will tell them the likelihood of a future gender identity. They will also take into account a range of other factors, and those factors include surgical options. People with intersex variations, aside from the human rights violations involved in surgical interventions to reinforce a sex assignment, are assigned female or male at birth. And most people will grow up to understand themselves in line with that sex assignment. So you can see us tonight who are speaking, with Morgan, Cody, me, Cody, and Bonnie. We have different ways of presenting ourselves that can take into account, the entirety of our lived experience and the different aspects of our identities, whether those are in line with our sex assigned at birth or not. So we're a really diverse population. And Bonnie, I kind of interrupted you. You were going on to talk about something else there. I'd like you able to pick it up there. Sorry.
Sure. I think these misconceptions that we're talking about, which we as intersex advocates spend quite a bit of time talking to try and extricate out what intersex is, has this indirect impact, I suppose, on parents, because the idea of intersex being not male or not female, or that all intersex people, or intersex being a third sex, really does create a, I suppose, through what Morgan said, clinicians do seek to create future adult heterosexual male or females. This is the kind of idea of clinical success for medical interventions, I suppose, when it comes to pediatric interventions for intersex people. So the inherent fear around non-binary identities and the idea that people need to be so incredibly aligned with either one of those binaries does create a fear of the term intersex in that kind of biomedical space. So much so that language has attempted to be removed and replaced with disorders of sex development.
Which I find that offensive. I think variations of sex characteristics is much more approachable, much more understanding, and has the ability to cross so many phobias and borders. And you can use that language quite significantly in clinical spaces as well as government spaces, and not upset any of the brittle-hearted people that live in those spaces. And excuse me for saying that. Although I prefer to use the word intersex, my young person prefers to use the word intersex because that is the language I have taught them. There is a very interesting question from Juniper Hart. Anyone want to have a go at that?
There's also a question here from Megan Walsh,
Okay.
directed at me. Can you tell us more about understanding your non-binary identity versus your intersex identity? I don't really want to get bogged down too much on this, but I think just to me they're very separate aspects of the self, and what that comes down to is like what points of advocacy I'm involved with to address my own needs, I guess, in a lot of ways. So as a non-binary person, I experience a lot of hostility in bathrooms, a lot of misrepresentation on forms. I've changed my birth certificate to have an X marker on it, and I've changed my name, but there was a whole process involved with that and costs involved with that. So a lot of that advocacy is focused on how do I present myself? How do I function in the world around me? how do I want to be perceived by people around me, how I want to function socially. I mean, our intersex advocacy is very, very focused on these experiences of putting an end to medical violence, about addressing the education needs of intersex people, about finding extremely broad ideas that encompass, intersex people who don't even use the term for themselves, might not even have a diagnosis yet, finding ways to protect that aspect of the population that is blind to the community that's actually fighting for them. And while, yes, it's hard to envision that I would still be non-binary if I didn't have experiences of being intersex in a way that was a way of reconciling the self. It is important to keep those aspects distinct so that I'm putting my best foot forward for each of those intersections as they need me. Anyway, Juniper Hart.
Yeah, Juniper's asked a question really about, Juniper's story about the difficulties of navigating multiple experiences and identities in particular spaces is challenging. And I think that very many people experience those challenges because, as Juniper has said, some people with intersex variations will not identify with the sex registered or observed at birth and will understand themselves as transgender. And that particular population experiences particular issues about the kinds of medical interventions that they could have experienced, which have reinforced a sex and gender that is not appropriate or desired. So there are particular issues that affect particular intersectionalities. For example, and being intersex and trans is one of those. And there are other ones as well that even occur within this concept of an LGBTI population or community as well. I mean, I guess a queer man as well as an intersex man, and that means I have to navigate a range of views about how bodies should look, appear, and function that are particularly pervasive in gay spaces with a lot of kind of body normativity. So there are lots of different kinds of experiences that people will have to navigate or do navigate because of the ways their identities and forms of expression or orientations intersect with each other.
Just on that particular note, Morgan, I work quite closely with a community member who unfortunately had a gender assignment which was not their gender. And when they were older, they decided that their gender was something that which was not assigned as their gender. That doesn't make them transgender. It makes them recognizing what gender they are and reaffirming who they are by whether or not surgery is necessary because of hormones that were taken, that were imposed on them as young people when they weren't aware of what that meant. So when I see an intersex person in a transgender space, I honestly think, is this the gender that was imposed on them that they're changing from? Or is this the gender that they should be? And that's what I think when I see a transgender person that comes from an intersex background. I don't know if that helps, but it's certainly how I tend to look at it.
I mean, I don't consider my like I don't consider my non-binariness to be a trans experience, but like I just want to jump to a thing here talking about a third sex. Is this goes back to what I was talking about in terms of needs and advocacy, is that yes, I want an X on my birth certificate as a non-binary person, but an X on my birth certificate as an intersex person would not have protected me from medical intervention. We need
That's right.
legislation to address medical intervention.
Mm.
So I think, yeah, in terms of recognition of third sex, that tends to be like a broad non-binary category, which I think has broadly been settled on as X, with X typically meaning non-binary, but sometimes having other language assigned to it, including intersex. But we know for a fact that just assigning a intersex birth certificate to a baby actually doesn't protect them, and in some situations exacerbates that. I think it was in Germany. That they did trial an intersex birth certificate, and what they found was that parents were opting in for surgery so that they wouldn't have to deal with the shame of having a child that was assigned intersex.
If I may as well, I mean, we have some empirical evidence in Australia as well, because the ACT government introduced a third category called intersex indeterminate unspecified in 2014. And the chief and health minister at that time said that that would satisfy a parental right and would also reduce the risk that parents would subject their children to gender conforming surgery. ERA actually opposed the reform back in 2014 for a variety of reasons, which we've documented on our website. And we can talk about if we need to. But it turns out that no children with intersex variations have been registered in that category. And I think that that expresses a disconnect where non-intersex people often think they're doing a good thing by constructing a separate category called intersex for intersex people. But really, most intersex people are women or men. Many of them are cisgender women or men. Some of them are transgender women or men. And a third category is not appropriate for them. And on the other hand, there's a population of non-binary people who are mostly not intersex, who maybe don't have a category that they're looking for. And this particular issue has come up in relation to forms and data collection recently, where in a couple of spaces in Queensland and Victoria, we myself and I think Bonnie as well, I don't know about Cody or Simone-Lisa, whether you've heard this as well, where at an event, I've heard non-binary trans people talk about having to select a box marked in intersex, indeterminate, or other to be acknowledged as non-binary because no other category exists for them. And at the same time, people with intersex variations are not choosing that box because they might have an intersex variation, but they're also male or female. So the consequences of inappropriate data collection mean that multiple populations can feel excluded at the same time or treated in ways that are troubling. And I'm just going to share a page on forms and data collection.
I mean,
that
there was also the train wreck that was the census this year, trying to impose non-binary sex as a gender classification and as a intersex classification. So not only was it not collecting accurate data about the non-binary population, it wasn't collecting data about intersex people either. And I mean, the reality is, I'm 33. I've done a few censi. I've lied on everyone. There is not the Australian government has not been able to collect accurate information about me or my experiences as an Australian. As far as I'm concerned, without that data, they're pretending I'm a Australian citizen that may as well not exist.
On that note, here in Tasmania, the health department in their pull down sex menu decided to put intersex as a sex nomination, which is inappropriate, not appropriate. They didn't add endosex either, and we're working to fix that situation. And also in the education department, in their enrollment form, they decided that knowing whether or not a child is intersex was not important because it was not necessary information. And as we know, intersex children require consistently more support than endosex children do. So when we're looking at data collection, it's exceedingly important that we get it right.
Thank you, Simone-Lisa. Just to be clear, I mean, the best way to record data on sex, gender, variations of sex characteristics is to rely on data collection with the 2020 ABS standard on sex, gender, variations of sex characteristics and sexual orientation variables. And there is a page on the ERA website, which is basically era.org.au/forms, that summarizes some of that information that you can go to afterwards. And when Simone-Lisa was talking about endosex, that's a word that just means non-intersex, because some intersex people are cisgender, some are transgender, some are queer, some are heterosexual. So none of those words can differentiate an intersex population from a non-intersex population. Sorry, Simone-Lisa.
Yeah.
It's okay. We can continue forward. That'd be great. Oh, also the resource that Cody and Gabrielle have been working on, which was released this week. Very important to understand about education and within the education system, I should say, and young people with intersex variations. I think that's a must read and something that anyone that's interested in supporting people with variations to sex characteristics should read.
I mean, I feel a little bit bad when people keep accrediting me to that, where Gabe actually did put all the words together and made it happen. All I really did was just yell at ShiftPat that it needed to happen until, you know, they hired Gabe to make it. But it is a phenomenal piece of work. I think also one of the things that we really get ahead of ourselves on data collection is that I guess like a part of my job with AGA is that we would get these inquiries into like policy and data collection and so on and so forth. And the first thing I'd always ask is like, you don't need to collect intersex data. Do you need to collect intersex data? I don't think you need to collect intersex data. And honestly, people don't even take that first step. Obviously, if you're working as part of an organization that's addressing the needs of an intersex person within the structure of that organization, then that's useful data to have. But we're talking more like Dendy, who are looking for tips on intersex allyship and are wondering if they need to include intersex on, you know, a cinema membership form. And it's just sort of like, that's not going to be useful data to you. And a matter of fact, like it's probably going to be quite reckless and irresponsible of you to even try to collect that data. And I think that when people don't often have that like step back mindset where you know they're already asking how should I be collecting that data. They're not asking themselves why they should be collecting that data, like trying to collect data on employee stats and that kind of stuff.
Oh, the question from Tom about protections against selective abortion. Morgan, this would be your answer.
Yeah, well, thank you for the question, Tom. Yeah, look, ERA has had long-standing concerns about the prenatal elimination of intersex traits, often on the basis of what we would see as exaggerated concern about the consequences for children who will be born with an intersex variation. And that means that we made submissions to the National Health and Medical Research Council in 2014 and 15. And we've more recently had some engagement with Mackenzie's Mission, which is a new pilot preconception screening program, to try and address some of these issues. The core problem, I think, is that stigma and a belief that people with intersex variations are disordered or deformed or inadequate lead to unnecessary medicalization, both postnatally and prenatally. And prenatally, assumptions about future lived experiences mean that parents might be, concern might be provoked in parents about a potential child when it's not really necessary, or it's not really a very accurate picture of a potential future child's life and ability to flourish. So we know that there is a lot of discrimination in the application of assisted reproductive technologies. And one of the difficulties here, I think, is again disentangling the issues faced by the intersex community from those of other communities that we are associated with. So, for example, the Victorian government has recently, I think, has now enacted some reforms. I could be wrong about whether they've been enacted or not, in an amendment to the legislation on assisted reproductive technologies. And they've included sex characteristics or discrimination on the grounds of sex characteristics in terms of access to assisted reproductive technologies, but not in the application of those technologies. So there's still the scope to eliminate future people with intersex variations through the use of assisted reproductive technologies in Victoria. And I think the situation is the same across Australia. We're actually working with a law firm, I hope, to try and get some more data on legislation around the country on this issue and a few others. So, Tom, your concerns about pre-implantation genetic testing and protections against, discriminatory applications of that technology are very real. I'm going to share a page that we have on genetics in the chat that you can go and link to. But it's basically, it's in our resources page on our website, era.org.au/genetics.
Just while we were waiting to go to the page, as a parent, I wouldn't have changed my child, not in any way, shape or form. He is the most amazing, funny, incredibly insightful person I have met, and I wouldn't change that for the world. So anyone that feels as though they need a termination of a child with a variation of sex characteristics, you're missing out. There's no doubt about it.
Yeah, could I just add? I mean, I think it's important that we also disentangle another issue, because, we're not talking, the intersex movement is not proposing that women should not have access to abortion.
Absolutely not, no.
The intersex movement favors bodily autonomy, and that means that women have the right to control what happens to their own bodies. What we're concerned about is a slightly different issue. So there is legislation across Australia that prohibits selective abortion on grounds of sex. Some jurisdictions, I believe, think that applies to intersex as well as to girls, because girls are the most usual subject of selective abortion globally. So I think that this is also an issue where different ideas about what intersex is, whether intersex is a sex or whether intersex is a variation of sex characteristics or a disorder of sex development, mean that different people, including clinicians and policymakers, can look at particular legislation in radically different ways, which actually mean that there are fewer protections for intersex people than policymakers might believe.
Language
that makes sense to people.
Language is exceedingly important, specifically in this case. And I think if we all use the same language, it would be, and definitions, it would be so much easier to move forward.
Robin wants to jump back to talking about forms and raises the idea that perhaps the visibility on forms represents an important inclusion, and the idea that intersex people may feel erased if you don't even try to ask the question. I think that that speaks to, like, we're having a conversation tonight about inclusive practice, and I think one of the core issues that we run into time and time again as intersex people is tokenistic inclusion is not useful to us. It has to be backed by competency every time, which, I think Bonnie is probably the best to address sort of like the idea of like service competency standards and some of the best practices in the field.
Yes, Bonnie, speak.
Hi everyone. I suppose what's been bubbling for me is there's been a lot of conversation that we've had around classification and markers and these types of things, and they are, while they're important, they do shift the emphasis away from us as individuals and as people that need to be understood and have services that we can access. I think one of the biggest distinctions for intersex people from, I suppose, trans and gender diverse populations as well, which is another issue that we've talked, is the way that self-determination works within healthcare settings. So intersex people often, in a pediatric setting, if their intersex variation is apparent at that stage, have to fight coercive medical interventions. Whereas I suppose when people get older and they try and access affirmative services, there can be unnecessary barriers in order to get the services that we need. And intersex people even also experience that as adults when they try and access affirmative healthcare. And sometimes that will be necessary for people who are seeking reparation treatments for earlier interventions that they've experienced, or because they are just seeking affirmative healthcare services. So I think that's the critical element here, is actually ensuring that the services that people need and want are available to them when they need them and when they want them. And that is directly, we're talking about issues around consent and informed consent, when that's the cause. Informed consent in this context obviously looks like people understanding fully the situation, understanding all the different terminology and language that's associated with their particular intersex variation in their body, having access to other people with those same types of bodies to be able to really unpack the types of medical protocols that they're engaging with, and also to look at their diverse options. We exist in a space where intersex bodies are pathologized in medicine and misunderstood in society. And medicine sees normal as being healthy, and society sees diversity as being healthy. So intersex people are really stuck in this middle ground where they are at once different, but at the same time normal. Because so that's probably not really very an articulate way of coming at it, but the truth is that it's all about, like, I think the real harms that come about when we're talking about intersex pediatric healthcare is the idea that people have to live with the decisions that get made at that time. And often those decisions are deferrable until people can be involved in those decisions for themselves. We're much more likely to have to remain empowered about our decision-making processes and to live with the consequences if we've actually been involved with them, been engaged and made informed consent choices at that stage. So that's a real pinnacle, I think, center of intersex advocacy and also provision of services to intersex people is ensuring how that person knows what the implications of any of these decisions that they are, the impact that different medications might have on them, or and understanding intersex as a real intersectionality that exists between different socio-political, social, cultural, and like areas. So people with intersex variations have really diverse needs in space and will likely require a real different host of services in order to have their needs met. The idea that intersex healthcare exists only within specialist teams in hospital doesn't treat the whole individual and doesn't treat them over their whole life. Intersex people are intersex their whole life. They're not just intersex as children and then fixed and then endosex people. Like, that's a big misinterpretation. So we have to be looking at all of life healthcare. We have to be looking at long-term mental health outcomes for any types of services that we can access. And we have to be centering that around community voices, because really our lived experiences are the evidence in this space in terms of that long-term psychosocial outcomes.
And I think that also, like, it's not just healthcare services, it's about our experiences in every sort of sector and the services that we engage with in each sector as well. So you still have to have a big picture concept of what the intersex experience is in your space before you can start to engage with that experience and do right by it.
So what I'm understanding is that people want to know how to be inclusive in the areas that they're working in. So if we take, and I know I'm just coming out of nowhere with this, but if we take the Darlington Statement and you take the professional standards in whatever profession you're in and you merge them together, you can come up with actions that are applicable to the environment you're in. And that is how we have inclusive spaces. And that is what Bonnie is asking for, is that we have inclusive spaces. With inclusive spaces, that means that people with variations to their sex characteristics feel safe. And it is important that in every profession and everywhere someone with variations to sex characteristics goes, that they feel safe, because there is less trauma.
Yeah. We've torn through some definitional stuff in record time. We've tackled some like personal hot button topics that are clearly close to us. We've had some stellar questions from this audience so far. With 20 minutes to go, who wants to talk about Intersex Awareness Day?
Well, I think we should talk about Intersex Awareness Day, but Bonnie, you wanted to share? Yeah, I
just wanted to just to follow on from that last conversational topic. I wanted to just talk a little bit about an intersex-led initiative called Yellow Tick, which was really like a process of trying to standardize some of the content and information that was being circulated to address some of the misconceptions that we have been talking about tonight. And Yellow Tick is really like a peer-led program with many of the people here today that like are from a number of different intersex-led organizations to try and ensure that services are more affirmative and that intersex inclusion is really meaningful. It's not tokenistic. And we do that through training and through policy. And one of the cool things that we did last year was to create a series of health and wellbeing pathway resources, which really you can download from the Yellow Tick, so darlington.org.au/yellow tick. those health and wellbeing resources are there. And there's been some real work there to try and as Simone-Lisa was saying before, see how the Darlington Statement sits alongside existing service standards. So like just say for like mental health or primary care, those types of service providers are bound by professional conducts and standards within their own disciplines. So some work has been done there to try and flesh out, I suppose, through a series of best practice indicators. So yes, across primary care, mental health, health specialists, so specialist services, peer-led organisations, so intersex-led organisations, social services, education and employment. So this is a kind of like a bit of a cheat sheet of how to have inclusive and affirmative practice based on existing standards mapped alongside community standards as seen in the Darlington Statement. Another thing that was really talked about before was the idea that we have intersectional needs across different stages. So we have tried to map that out in terms of different life stages and what might be needed in clinical spaces, in social and legal contexts, but then also in terms of access to peer support and advocacy, because those things really fit together in an intersectional kind of zone. And as service providers, people might jump into your service at any one of these life stages and might need to have, when it becomes apparent that they have an intersex variation, if they disclose that to you, they might require a host of different social services. They might require clinical services, or they might require access to those peer supports. Invariably, they probably will require access to peer supports. So that's a kind of an example of some of the community-led resources that exist to try and articulate how services can become better informed and how they can play an advocacy role and an ally role in terms of working with community-led organisations to meet the needs of intersex people.
So that.
Thank you. Could I, sorry, Simone-Lisa. I think it's important to acknowledge that those resources are fantastic and they set out best practice. For most organisations, those are aspirational. Most institutions have not taken a journey to implement those standards as yet. And I think, I'm not sure what you're going to say, Simone-Lisa, but I'd like us to kind of move on, because the issues that Bonnie has raised about medical practice and the need for peer support and standards, but those are all issues that have come up in the new publication, the new major report by the Australian Human Rights Commission, which is about ensuring health and bodily autonomy for people born with variations of sex characteristics. And yeah, so Simone-Lisa, did you want to have a word before we move on to that?
I was just going to basically talk about my project, but I'm more than happy to segue, if you like. Basically, being able to take the Darlington Statement and mesh it with professional standards from a profession and come up with actions that are applicable in that professional environment is something that we do in the Yellow Tech. I have done that with midwives. I think it's exceedingly important that at the moment of life, it's a positive environment. It's a positive situation. There's a positive outcome. And by educating midwives that variations of sex characteristics are a natural part of our species variation, that will give a positive impact to when a child with a variation to sex characteristics is born, which, as we know from empirical evidence, when we have a positive impact when we are born, our life has a positive start. And so by meshing both the professional standards and the Darlington Statement together, we can then have actions that increase that positive environment and give that child and that family a different way of thinking other than a very clinical, pathological way of thinking. And doing that means that that child is less likely to have harm done to them at a young age. And they're more likely to be able to have consensual support in the future when they're old enough to do so. So
Thank
I
you,
think,
Lisa.
yes, and I think that segues nicely into the Australian Human Rights Commission report.
Yeah, so the Australian Human Rights Commission published a report that's been 3 years in the making last week. It's called Ensuring Health and Bodily Integrity for people born with variations in sex characteristics in the context of medical interventions. It's an extraordinary in-depth analysis of the current situation that we're confronted with, which is one where human rights abuses on infants and children with intersex variations remain routine across all jurisdictions in Australia and also in Aotearoa, New Zealand. The report made 12 recommendations, including criminalizing unnecessary medical interventions on infants and children with intersex variations, and legislating to provide independent oversight, guidelines, a data bank, resource community services, including peer support, and provide for community-based participatory research. Maybe Cody, would you like to give it? What's your impression of the report? And they ask Simone-Lisa and Bonnie as well.
I mean, it really. I think what stood out to me the most when I was reading through it is that it really consolidates like decades of work in the space. Like it's referencing inquiries from years ago. It's referencing, studies and pieces of work from 2006, from 2013, from. It's taken on the input of all these different like intersex organizations and intersex individuals who were willing to like contribute like their voices into this space. And what is produced is something that is very, very clearly fine-tuned through an intersex lens, that it's very, very compassionate towards the needs of intersex people, and really just does reinforce everything that we want and everything that we've needed for decades now. So it's sort of it's been very, very reassuring in that sense, and it does create this standard that we can start to hold governments to account to in a lot of ways. And I think like that, to me, that's where I sort of exist in a very interesting space in the ACT, where the fight for intersex legislation is already practically won, where it's a few steps away, but like the intent is there, the work is happening. It's a matter of process. It's not a matter of decision making anymore. And it's a similar situation for Victoria and Tasmania as well. But I think that one thing that really stood out to me is we learned of the story of Noah, a 10-year-old intersex boy in the Northern Territory, who, has also gone through this process of medical violence and has grown up resentful, and rightfully so, that these choices were made for him. And the reality is, this legislation should have existed 10 years ago for Noah, but if it only existed in the ACT, Victoria and Tasmania, it still wouldn't have helped Noah. We need federally consistent standards. We need more states taking up this work as well. We need to make sure that intersex people are protected in all jurisdictions. So it reinforces the work we've already done, but also lays out the path for the next 10 years of work. So it's reassuring and exhausting.
Thank you, Cody. Yeah, I think it's important to recognise then that both ACT and Victoria have made commitments to reform. I'm perhaps a little more cautious than Cody. I think there's a lot of work in both jurisdictions to get reform across the line. And I think there's also a need to push for reform in other jurisdictions around Australia. Marnie, would you feel okay saying a couple of words about what's happened today in Aotearoa?
I wasn't going to say anything because this really feels like Australia's day, but I think it's important to know that the medical profession sees no boundaries. So Australia and New Zealand, the clinicians operate the same. So today in New Zealand, our Associate Minister of Health, the Honourable Alicia Beryl, released a video and made significant commitments to what New Zealand is doing and plans to do. So she reiterated the statement that's made in the manifesto. And we were talking before we started today just how long-term this work is. And I really want to acknowledge the work of my colleagues in Australia and some of the people who are also on the call tonight. So, you know, this is long, slow, patient work. We're getting there. There's lots of allies watching tonight. So to pull us across the line, we really are going to rely on lots of people supporting us. We're getting there, but we still aren't there yet. So for all the knowers, you know, those of us, this year's my 25th year, and I would not have believed when I started that 25 years on, we still haven't got those protections in place, but we're getting closer. Thanks for the opportunity to talk, Morgan.
Oh, thank you for speaking, Marnie, and your wisdom is always so much appreciated. Bonnie or Simone-Lisa, would you like to make any comments on the Human Rights Commission report? Bonnie, like myself and a couple other people, you were on the expert reference group for that work, and it has been a very patient process. Yes.
Yeah, I can attest to that, and it was quite painstaking, I suppose, in terms of like actually participating in those processes was quite difficult because there were a lot of competing interests in those groups. And, you know, I like to say, I'm really happy with the report. I think the recommendations are incredibly welcome and not surprising from the point of view of an intersex person with lived experience that's participated in this process. I often say that the road to intersexy land is paved with cognitive dissonance. And I say that because we have really different agents that look at intersex people. Parents look at us differently, clinicians look at us differently, society looks at us another way, and we see ourselves a third way. And often all of these people really come to the table with best interest in mind from their different points of view. And I think what we've seen in terms of this report is something that we see more broadly in intersex healthcare and also in intersex advocacy, which is a long history of people, of clinicians, knowing that harm has been done through the administration of ostensibly experimental interventions over the last 20 years, 30 years, 40 years on intersex people. And in that same time, we've also seen a massive resistance towards lived experience, declaration, the voice of consumer input into those clinical processes, and also a lot of resistance to regulation, generally speaking. So I think it's that's the kind of has pushed intersex advocacy into the human rights lens. And I think it's really, from my point of view, a massive win to actually have that validation and in having our concerns that really aren't new. People have been saying these exact same things that Noah has been saying for more than 30 years now. So these issues haven't changed. And there's been plenty of opportunity, I suppose, for people in power, in clinical power, having clinical power to actually amend those treatments so that they are less harmful, or to have no.
If I may, Bonnie, I mean, I think that this has played out in the media in recent days as well, where clinicians have asserted that medical practices have changed and that some previous practices were harmful. And that's good in one sense, but it also shows a continuing failure to get to grips with the harms that are being performed now and that are taking place now in hospitals around our countries, in all of our jurisdictions. So, and I think also, as well as failing to reckon with the continuing harm today, the acknowledgements of historic harms that have occurred, that have been said verbally, sporadically, that appear in some news reports, don't really reflect any kind of institutional apology or redress. And the issue of redress, I think, is one in particular that remains to be examined in detail. There are so many people, who live for the rest of our lives with the consequences of unnecessary and unwanted medicalization.
I would also add, in terms of my reflections on those types of clinical processes, is I want to just identify the huge amounts of financial resources that the clinical and biomedical framework has received in order to reinforce what are ostensibly harmful practices and what have been declared as harmful practices in this report and by numerous UN agencies. So the part of the human rights report that I most welcome is the distinct call for funding for our peer-led organizations to meet the very huge peer support demands of the community and to create resources, messaging and public health messaging and education resources that are fit to task, that speak of community experiences and meet community expectations. And I think that recentering language outside of that biomedical into a social construct is really important because it creates pathways that people can live with. And it's much more appropriate, I think. I have to measure this with a lot of caution, as well as someone that participated in the 2013 Senate inquiry into forced and coerced sterilization of intersex people in Australia. If you haven't checked it out, get yourself a cup of chamomile tea and or 6 and have a read. But that was also another monumental document in Australia in terms of highlighting, presenting a level playing field between a bipartisan Senate committee to try and do their own independent research into the medical treatments that intersex people have experienced. And that Senate inquiry produced, I think, 15 recommendations that were ostensibly responded to by the government of the time by sending it to the state and territories for comment with no funding, and therefore it was effectively shelved. So what's really most important about this human rights report is that it actually gets implemented, and that requires allies. It requires everyone here saying that these recommendations can't go unmentioned or unacted upon. It's so critically important because finally we feel like we've had our human rights concerns heard by the peak body for the issue in Australia. But if government doesn't pick it up and government doesn't provide the necessary supports to do it effectively, then it will create division within health communities, within our communities, and you know, like it's all of our responsibility to have the society that we want to have.
Yeah, thank you, Bonnie. If I may, let's make 2 points. One is that the medical community is divided, and some of those divisions have been made evident in the Human Rights Commission's report, where the Commission identified that pediatric, well, they identified that the clinicians who don't come from a psychological or psychiatric background were making decisions based upon psychosocial outcomes. So ideas that children would be better having bodies that look normal so they wouldn't be exposed to stigma or discrimination or the mental health consequences of having a body that's different. But clinical organizations of psychologists and psychiatrists made submissions to the Human Rights Commission that firmly rebutted those claims. So the medical community is divided, and I think that we're now seeing that in ways that are, you know, in writing that we haven't seen quite as starkly before. But, you know, division alone or identifying those issues alone doesn't resolve them. And from the perspective of somebody who's an executive director who works part-time, was paid part-time rather, and has 2 part-time staff members, and where other organizations like Intersex Peer Support Australia have no paid staff, and where ITANS, I think, has only a couple of part-time staffers as well. We are dealing with a greatly increasing workload as jurisdictions finally realize there are problems that need to be addressed because we've been successful in raising them, but we are going to be completely overwhelmed by the demands that are involved in trying to meet those needs.
So if anyone's got a spare $1 million burning a hole in their pocket, you could throw it at us. We wouldn't say no.
So
yeah, if anyone can handle overwhelmed, it's us. Like, obviously,
totally. Overwhelmed is my story. But anyway, my response to the Australian Human Rights Commission report is that it correlates directly with the Tasmanian Law Reform Association recommendations for change to legislation. So for me, that report from the Commission supports everything that I'm doing down here in Tasmania, and it supports the legislative change that I'm moving forward with in the Tasmanian jurisdiction.
Thank you, Simone-Lisa. We're kind of hitting time. We've tried, I think, directly or indirectly to respond to the questions that have been raised in chat, and thank you so much for engaging via chat. I'd like to ask if Cody, Simone-Lisa, or Bonnie, if you have any kind of brief kind of remarks to finish on. And if people would like to stay behind and ask any questions that you still have that are burning, then please do.
Honestly, I like we didn't necessarily have a formal structure to this evening, but I knew that tonight was going to be really interesting because I'd be sitting here talking with 3 of the most interesting people I know. And I think it has been that this evening. And honestly, I wish I could do this for another 3 hours because honestly, when we bring voices this strong together and you start to take account of how we're changing the world, it is really encouraging. It does fill you with hope and optimism.
I've really enjoyed spending time with the people I love the most in the world, which is clearly Morgan, Cody, and Bonnie, which it's amazing how much change you have managed to do in the little time I've been a part of your lives. And I really enjoy spending time supporting people with the understanding of what intersex is.
Thank you, Simone-Lisa. Bonnie, do you have any kind of concluding thoughts? Or...
Yeah, I suppose as intersex advocates and peer workers, we're busy paving the yellow brick road to the Crystal Castle. You know, like we can't pave it right up to everyone's front doorstep. So you have to get out there and get your hands dirty a little bit as ally and connect up with that big like golden superhighway to the promised intersexy land. And to do that, I encourage everyone to not be afraid to really lean into that difficulty that goes with actually recognizing the complexity and the simplicity that's associated with intersex, to try and do the work that you can do the research, do your own research, do what you can, and then reach out to intersex-led organizations and individuals to try and like just put the finishing touches on your amazing advocacy work. So thank you so much for coming to hear us talk about these issues in our own words. It really is worth its weight in gold.
And the castle is definitely purple, just saying.
Thank you all for coming along tonight. Thank you to our speakers and for everybody for engaging with the conversation. This has been a bit unstructured. We do provide structured training if you would like to talk with us about having a trainer come to your work or your organization to help educate about intersex health, well-being, human rights, and inclusion, inclusive practice. So thank you very much for engaging. I'm going to turn off the recording, and maybe a couple of us will hang around if anybody has any burning questions that you'd like to raise. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ricky, for coming along. Much appreciate your appearance. Thank you. Just someone